to all of you for giving up your time to help our work, and really delighted to welcome Professor Jane Robinson, who's PVC Engagement and Place at Newcastle. Hello, Jane. Professor Jonathan Grant, who's Professor of Public Policy at King's. Hello. Amatey, I'm not welcoming yet because he's not with us. Hattie Tollerson, hello Hattie, SU President at London South Bank University, and Ben Vulliamy, Chief Exec of the University of York SU. Hello Ben, you're all extremely welcome. So the Student Futures Commission has got a very wide-ranging brief, which is about what students want and need to ensure that they can go on being successful or be successful at university post-pandemic. And in this session this afternoon, we're concentrating on student experience, student engagement and participation. This morning we've had a brilliant session on mental health and well-being. I'm sure a lot of that's all intertwined. Yeah, there are really two sides of this. One is to hear, your answers, ideas, solutions, but also for you to flag up any areas where you think our inquiry needs to dig a bit deeper. So this is about defining issues as well as solutions. It's quite a packed session, so if you could try to keep your answers and any follow-up questions reasonably short, and please do use the chat function and electronic hands up if you want to come in. That's for commissioners and our guests. The session is being recorded, and we will be publishing a transcript on the Student Futures website afterwards. So we've split the session into sort of 15-minute slots covering different angles, and some of my fellow commissioners will be kind of chairing those different slots and putting questions to our guests. But as I said, do intervene if you've got something to say. We really want to hear. We really want to hear it. If anyone's observing the session, perhaps you could keep your camera and microphone off. That would be really helpful. And we'll be tweeting using the hashtag Student Futures. So let's get moving. So I'm just going to start with quite a broad question, if I may, to all our guests. And perhaps I could start with you, Jonathan, and ask you, based on everything you've experienced over the last year or so and things that you've seen other colleagues doing in the sector, do you think there are things about how higher education has been delivered and managed which you'd want to see continue from next September and into the future?
Well, the short answer is yes. I think there's been an incredible response by the whole sector and all communities within the sector to the pandemic, and the fact that we can mobilize so rapidly, innovate reasonably successfully, and continue to deliver our core purposes is something we should celebrate and not lose sight of. That doesn't mean it's all been perfect. And, I think inevitably when you do these sort of exercises, people focus on what hasn't worked. But I think there's a lot of stuff that has worked. And I guess I would, off the top of my head, pull out 2 or 3 themes from that. One is the obvious theme of moving online, learning to online. I wouldn't advocate that we should be delivering everything online in the future, but I think the lessons around a sort of blended approach and a more flexible approach is something we need to hang on to, not least because some of the access arguments around that, students like the flexibility that sort of alternative mode of delivery has offered. I think in a strange sense, right at the beginning of the pandemic, I was still VP at King's, so I was, sat in all these horrendous gold meetings and silver meetings and what have you. And in the first few months, it was real command and control, and you know, that was probably right and inevitable. But I think as we sort of settled into that, actually a much more open and networked form of management governance delivery occurred. And I think on the whole, senior leaders learnt that you know, their staff, their students, their people can deliver without what I would term the managerialism that has crept into our institutions. So actually it liberated to a degree some of the systems, and I would like to see that held on to.
Yeah,
yeah.
Sorry.
Well, so my final comment was then the one around engagement. I just think, you know, I sent a note to one of my former colleagues saying, you know, can you give me any good stories about student engagement? And I got a list of 20 responses, all of which I was not aware of. And I got 20 which I am aware of. And that level of engagement and that student contribution and staff contribution to local communities, you know, at some point we've got to find a way of pulling that together and really celebrating those contributions.
Yeah, fantastic. Hattie, maybe I could come to you and ask what you'd like to see carry on, and whether that sense of students being much more involved in working with senior leadership in universities was something that you experienced as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this year's been a really good year actually for student voice and student engagement, and institutions actually having to listen to what the student experience really is and what issues there are, and fixing those very, very quickly. I think, as you've just mentioned, actually, we've gotten into a habit as higher education of taking a long time to do things. But this year's been a great experiment in, oh my goodness, let's do something really, really quickly. We have to do it and make it work for students as best as we can. And I think that's been really exciting actually to, you know, see things happen very quickly. So moving online lectures, you know, changing assessment types, really exploring that digital world of how we can deliver teaching and assessments online. But I think within that, some really important like thoughts have been lost. So we haven't taken the time to think about, you know, what does this mean for a student in real life? Like how, you know, what's really happening in people's home lives now that we're bringing the classroom into your home. The move to digital learning has obviously been beneficial to some people in terms of access, but for others, so much like in my institution, for example, parent learners, all that stuff, it's made it a bit more difficult at times, especially with the different types of lockdown restrictions and stuff. But yeah, it's been exciting to see different types of institutions finally take that lead on listening to students' unions, listening to student leaders, taking a lot more time to think about student feedback and putting out, you know, pulse surveys, module surveys, you know, mid-year reviews, and really looking at that data properly and digging deep into where it's working, where it isn't working, and splitting that up by demographics and all that stuff. So
that's really helpful. Ben, does that sound a familiar story to you as well?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think, I mean, that triggered something for me, which is about this kind of really authentic human type of relationship that we've now established. So, you know, I'm exaggerating a little to make a point, but you know, historically we had perhaps very, very corporate language we would use when we talk to people that talked about us as an authority, and the student as the consumer or the passenger, or, you know, call it what you want. And instead, what we've started to show is a bit more authenticity about our own fears, our own anxieties, our own uncertainty. And I think that's quite precious. You know, I'm not sure it's always landed, but I think if we can maintain some of that kind of honesty about the journey that we are all on together, that will help the relationships we form with students. I guess the other thing that I'm struck by that I would like to preserve, protect, and grow in future, that I've seen over the last couple of years, is the way that our students and our institutions have become much more interested in the places we inhabit. So, you know, the fact that we saw nurses accelerating out of their course of study and into the NHS, the fact that we saw students and staff come together to build pop-up vaccines and testing centres on campuses with other local colleges and other institutions is wonderfully civic. The fact that students were volunteered to bring up the elderly and deliver their meds really early on in this, as it came to light. If we can maintain some of that in a way that has a really positive narrative to it, that isn't just underpinning services that are creaking at the seams and underfunded, but is actually, you know, working with our places and our people, then it could be a wonderfully powerful thing to protect moving forward.
That's wonderful, Ben, and that gives me a wonderful segue to hand the microphone to Jane. Jane, I mean, this is your job, isn't it? And did you find that the last year or so has made your job harder or easier? And what would you like to take forward into the future? Just relatively briefly, if you could.
Yeah. I mean, I think sort of colleagues have sort of picked up on a number of things, and I think like everything, there have been both huge challenges but also opportunities. I mean, I do think that we have seen rapid innovation in response to the challenges, and I think that has been enabled by this collaboration and this sense of co-design of solutions with our students, but also with our partners. I would say we have never seen such close working between our civic partners in the NHS, public health, local government, but very much working with our students. And I think just sort of building on some of the points Ben made, our students being seen as and seeing themselves as citizens of place. And I think that's really been brought to the fore.
That's that's such a wonderful idea, citizens to face our students. Amatey, and welcome, by the way, because I didn't manage to welcome you earlier. You obviously see things through a slightly different lens these days in your current role, but your roots go back to the student union as well. Any thoughts from your side about, perhaps just briefly, what you think is the most important thing to take forward post-pandemic?
I think all the yeah, and good to be here. It was definitely a problem on my end. There were all sorts of barriers to me trying to get in. But good to be here. I think all the points really have been made that I was going to make, the points around the civic engagement. I guess I would the flexible delivery. The thing I think I would just draw out is that what's been quite interesting, looking at some of the data around Black, Asian and minority ethnic student attainment gaps and how they have reduced actually over the last year. And I don't think we're fully at the bottom of exactly how or why that happened, but clearly something changed, and if we can find out what things were there that led to some of those changes. Obviously, it's not the full extent of the problem, but I think that there might be something. And I suspect it's around the more flexible delivery of education, the fact that students perhaps had more opportunities to revisit material in a way that previously they hadn't, but also the changes in assessment as well. And actually, when we talk about some of those barriers, often they land in some of those spaces. Now we know there's the wider package around student experience and the support services which contribute to these challenges as well. But something has changed, and I think it's important that we try and get to the bottom of that and seek to keep those aspects moving forward.
Yeah, very important point. Thank you so much for those openers. I'm going to hand over to Mark. Mark, I'm conscious that we're all the chair has already let the time run over a bit, but so do steal a couple of extra minutes, but maybe
no panic, Mary. Thank you very much, and lovely to meet everybody. It's been a really interesting few weeks as a commissioner, listening to all the innovation and the evidence supporting that, and I think the universities are working with their students have done some amazing work. But I'd like to sort of drill into the other aspect of a university experience, which is the extracurriculum activities. I think there's plenty of evidence that the hybrid learning has worked really well during the pandemic. But in our recent poll, working with students, over half mentioned that they hadn't had any participation in extracurricular activities. So actually, Hattie, to start, what's the experience? What's your experience at your institution, and what can universities do to both increase that student participation in extracurricular activities? Do you think we need to reboot it? And there's two cohorts here. There's the students starting this coming academic year, where we would hope that they would just get back into normal. And how about the students that have been affected by pandemic more. So Hattie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, actually, and it lines up quite nicely with the work that we've done as a Students' Union in partnership with our institution this year. So this year we relaunched our strategy, and we are an institution type that we know our students come to get an academic experience where they will get better employment from it. So our students are coming to our institution for a purpose, and we knew that as a Students' Union we weren't offering things that lined up with that. So we had a look at other institutions where Students' Unions were being really successful in partnership with the institution. And that was all around academic societies and academic and co-curricular activity. So not necessarily offering things like your arts and crafts club, but it's offering an occupational therapy society for your occupational therapy students. They can run a conference, get involved in professional spaces, making sure that we've got one for every single course so that we're supporting the students' learning journey and making it, much more engaging and engaging students with their professional learning communities and all of that kind of stuff outside of their classroom. So providing that, extra experience really, and working, with academics to deliver those things, if that's, a trip out or, helping our nurses and our midwife students with things that they wouldn't be able to have the time or that their academics don't have time to deliver, but we're there to step in and, help along with that. And I think it's really interesting because it seems to be really working. And I think that's the extra and co-curricular activity, that's the biggest thing that's had a take up in the pandemic, is students that are looking for that extra help, with that learning loss almost, that they've been able to take part in. And then we've not been able to stop those things, despite the pandemic, whereas sports and some other societies have had a real struggle this year to gain and engage members, but our academic societies program has absolutely exploded. And I think that's been
and that's interesting, isn't it, Hattie? Because I think it's quite interesting, I'm really encouraged by that co-curricular, but I wonder what your view is from a student union about the extracurricular, i.e., you're doing a course in construction. What about actually being really interested in art over here, because that's what your passion is? Has that gone? Can that come back? Is that valued by student unions?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be the struggle this year in gaining back. And I think Organised Fun and US and some other organisations and Bucks as well have done a lot of research into this, that we will have I think almost a lost generation of student leaders, because a lot of what we do is obviously engaging students to lead those activities, and that might be really difficult to get back because we've had a year where activities essentially stopped, but it's about putting resource into training our students, upskilling them, providing them those opportunities to again learn things they wouldn't learn on their course, like budget management or leadership or that kind of stuff, to get engaged in those things. And I think it is possible to get back this almost lost generation of activities. I think it's how we frame it and how we engage students, into these activities, and showing them that it's not just all get involved in the Disney Society. It's you're going to get a really solid community of friends around you. That's the reason why I didn't drop out of university. And many other sabbatical officers and many other students, that are engaged in activities across the sector will tell you that, being involved in the netball team or being involved in the gaming and society is the reason that they're at university. And I think there's actually some really interesting dynamics with that in terms of our student diversity and our student populations. I think one thing that I really like to hammer on about is that our BAME community of students are 2 to 3 times more likely less to drop out of university if they're involved with activities, but they're often the smallest diverse.
I think as somebody who's just a tad older than you, Hattie, my memory of university is as much revolved around the extracurricular work that I did as it is my studies. Ben, Hilary, we've got a question from you, but can I just ask Ben? Ben, any views from your perspective, because you've worked both at Leeds and at York? Would you add to Hattie? Have you got any other views?
Yeah, I'd add a little bit. Indulge me. Let me tell a very quick story of the year in terms of this co-curricular activity. September the 29th.
And extracurricular.
Yes. September the 29th was pre-arrival, and we had our first ever online freshers fair, giving students a choice of clubs, societies, volunteering programs to get involved in. We had 9,059 individual student hits pre-arrival. Okay. Of those 9,059 requests for further information, the most popular groups they were asking about were Outdoor Society was top. That tells us something. Dog Walking Society was second. Debating Society was third. Badminton, baking, Feminist Society, yoga, Murder Mystery Society, movie society. So lots of kind of outdoorsy things there, lots of stuff about dialogue and discussion and debate. That's incredible. Roll forward to term 2, and they've joined clubs and societies, but those societies have been a bit more, dare I say, dormant than they expected, a little bit more online and less physical than they hoped and aspired for. And actually, by that time, we were actually rebating £8,000 worth of sports club memberships to sports team sign-ups. You know, we were saying, look, you signed up to the football team because you wanted to play football at a high level and meet people and train together. You didn't get to do that. You have done a load of cool online fundraising. You have done an online quiz. You have maybe done some one-on-one training and coaching, you know, whatever else, but you didn't get to play football. So we need to give you your money back. So they did do some stuff within the Football Society, but it wasn't what they signed up for. I mean, that's quite notable when you think about what's happening with the debate about fees for tuition fees and things like that. That, you know, we've taken a different standpoint on that. Interestingly, in term 2, so this was as we were in full lockdown, there were 2,762 unique students signed up to one or more academic society. So these are the societies that bring their, you know, the maths discipline and maybe set up some online maths tuition for a local school or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
So you know, that was preserved quite well. Around about a quarter of our students were signed up to one or more. Yeah. So I mean, that's the story we've experienced. In terms of, you know, I totally agree there is a risk of a lost generation here, that there are some students who came to university and spent 12 months, you know, making friends within their halls of residence because they were kind of locked in them. And we need to break that. There are phrases I've heard our staff and our students use, which is double freshers, which I think is interesting, where they're saying, okay, normally we would do a freshers arrival orientation program where we showcase student life to new students. This year, we're going to have to prepare to do it to new and returning students. Yeah. We are preparing to try and give out £30,000 worth of free memberships to our students. We're not sure if we can do it yet, but we're trying to look at if we kind of seed fund the reinvention of student societies as this extra and co-curricular.
And that's great, isn't it? I guess one of the key takeaways is this extra fresher for the students that had a very virtual year last year, to reintroduce them to the wider excitement of university. I'd like to just quickly ask Hilary. I'm going to come to you. I've got 4 minutes. I want to ask Jane. Jane, on the issue of sort of place and engagement. I mean, that must be really exciting, because we've got this amazing resource of your students that we want to get them doing things out with of their degree. Surely we can use them to go out to engage with the wider community in many different ways, which would be a boost to the students and to your engagement with your civic society. Jane, any thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think what was really incredible this year was we actually saw more than ever our students engaging in that way. We have an annual Pride of Newcastle Awards, and we had over 900 nominations for students who had been engaged in activity. So, and that ranged from things like our NEST programme, which is North East Solidarity and Teaching, which connects student volunteers to asylum seekers and refugees. We have linked to that, we've developed our Civic University agreement, working in the city in partnership with Northumbria University, and we've developed a strand called Students as Partners, which is working with our partners in the city. So student volunteering activity has been really, I think, more visible than ever before. And I think, as you say, the thing about it is very much the sense that this is something that students themselves are really positive about engaging in and benefiting from in terms of transferable skills, but also it's a very significant benefit to the local community. So actually, ironically, we have seen that extracurricular activity grow over the last 18 months.
And I'm brilliant, Jane. I'm going to be told off by Mary in a moment, but just one more quick question for you, 10 seconds of Mel, then I'm going to go Jonathan and Hilary. Has that engagement with place amongst students, has that increased during COVID? If you look back to pre-COVID, and then I guess how do we take that forward? How do we encourage that amongst our student cohorts going forward? 30 seconds.
I think in short, it has, and part of that, if I'm honest, has been there have been some challenges in terms of communities where we've had high populations of students and outbreaks in the pandemic, which has really forced us to sort of think about how we work with those local communities. So I think it's about building those and continuing on those relationships to make sure that we continue to build on what we've learned over the last year or so.
Thank you, Jane. Hilary, you've been very patient. Over to you. If I can say 30 seconds, if you will, please. Thank you.
No worries. I'm good at speaking fast, so don't you worry at all. I know that in what you've all discussed, you've talked about the richness of extracurricular activities and things that students do outside of what they've done traditionally. And I think there's been a really important link about students not using it for what it traditionally was used for. So like people joining football clubs and doing runs to raise money for the NHS. And I was wondering if you had any reflections on how students have been able to be linked up with the university, the community and the students' union and really being able to work as part of that during the pandemic and how that might influence going forward.
And that question's for for Jane or for Jonathan?
I was just going to suggest maybe if Jonathan wants to pick that one up and then he
can
make his
Hilary, that's great. Jonathan, could you had your hand up. Could you add into the debate?
Yeah, so my comment, and it sort of is tangential to Hilary's question, which is why I sort of dropped my hand. But I just think we need to be careful when we talk about place, because what we have experienced over the last 18 months is a virtual place for lots of people, and a place that is not physically the same as the university they are attending. So lots, so in Jane's example, no doubt Jane had lots of students in Newcastle and they made a contribution to the place of Newcastle. But I suspect there are lots of students who were students of Newcastle no longer residing in Newcastle. And we cannot forget those students in these conversations.
Yeah. Yes, I think that's a very interesting point, isn't it? Because depending on your university, you'll have a different diaspora of students, with different perspectives and so forth. Mary, Hilary, I haven't really addressed because the question. I mean, I haven't really addressed your question, but perhaps we can return to that at the end of the debate this afternoon and see whether we tackle that point. Mary, I think I've probably done my bit. If I hand back to yourself, and thank you so much for your answers, everybody.
Thank you. Jane, I saw you waving. Did you want to make a quick point?
Just very briefly, I think sort of perhaps picking up a bit on Hilary's question and also the points that Jonathan was making, that I think that we ran a scheme which was a peer mentor scheme, which was around UN SDG challenges for new students, and that was all online. But what I think was great about that was that it was an opportunity for new students to connect with existing students through peer mentoring, but putting it into the context of UN SDGs and a sort of challenge, so they could think about both, their local place, but what that meant on a global scale as well. But that was something that was really well received, and we're going to look to run that again in future. So just an example in response to Hilary's question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, and I've certainly, in reading about online teaching and learning, I've certainly read about how place doesn't stop being important just because you're learning online, and perhaps our conceptualization of what place means changes slightly, but it definitely doesn't go away. Fantastic. Let's move on to Richard's going to ask some questions.
Thank you, Mary, and a great discussion so far, and thank you to everybody for coming today to give evidence. We hugely appreciate it. So I'm going to kick off with a question for Amatey. And Amatey, obviously we've just heard from Jonathan and from others around how engagement has, really sort of something that we want to maintain post or through the last bit of this part of the pandemic. And obviously you've been working as a consultant around supporting the development of university strategies and the implementation of those strategies, and of course we'll have a lot of experience of this from an NUS point of view. What have you seen in terms of the change in thinking around student engagement within the sort of university's priorities and their strategies, and what would you like to see change going forward?
That's a really good question. I think the first thing I would say is that, and this may just be because we're dealing with a relatively small sample in the last year. I mean, one of the challenges that has happened is that university strategies in general have been through a bit of a sort of a rough patch. In one sense, some of the strategic initiatives have had to be canned. Some have gone for sort of shorter interim strategies, and others are thinking big and completely, changing. But I haven't been on any pieces of work or any projects which have been the sort of COVID strategy or strategy kind of coming out of COVID. Having said that, I think, like the conversation we were having earlier, I think universities are far more attuned to the student experience, or have had to become far more attuned to the student experience, and some of the, and in a much more real-time way now. So I think previously universities would have, and it's a sliding scale, but previously there would have been a bit more of a focus on NSS and some of the kind of big milestones in the, we'll do a big survey, or some of the big kind of milestones in the student feedback calendar, whereas actually they've had to get a bit smarter at trying to get that real-time information, partly because they've been making a lot of quick changes and kind of need to get a sense early on for what that looks like. Now, you get that through in some cases pulse surveys. I've seen some institutions adopt more regular engagement with students, and there are lots of digital tools to do that. But you also just get that through more conversations, and the link with the student union, as kind of Hattie was talking about, has been a kind of critical part of that. What I haven't seen yet is that translate into, and this just might be my exposure, but I haven't seen that translate into a new strategic direction in which student engagement is completely reconceptualized in a different way. So I think if that is one thing to come out of it, that is something that I'd really want to see, and us really not forgetting that in the possibilities there are in the digital world and in that connectivity in that way, there are possibilities there from a student engagement point of view that we should seek to utilize as well. But I haven't seen it yet, sort of COVID be a big strategic shift. I think the institutions that were doing it already really well have continued to do so, but I haven't really seen it. But others may have other perspectives.
And do you have any thoughts on how you'd like to see it shift, or is it too early to say?
I think, and this might be a bit of a kind of worms here. This might be a bit controversial, but I think that one of the challenges that you have with student experience as a whole is that it often straddles lots and lots of different portfolios. So we're starting to see some kind of PVC student experience roles which are trying to bring together all the different elements of the student experience, but it's kind of, part of it is sat in the education portfolio, other bits are sat with sort of on the professional services side with student support, and that kind of disjointed element means that you don't often sometimes get that whole picture of the student journey. I happen to think the same with staff as well, actually, in terms of really elevating the role of the staff journey as well to that senior table, rather it's kind of been buried in HR, somewhere in professional services. But I would like to see a bit more of a move to, I don't know, maybe some chief student officers or people who are able to kind of take that portfolio and really have the clout in the institution to make sure that all elements of the student journey are lined up. Everyone understands the role that they play in the student experience, and that person has the kind of authority to really make the changes that they need to make in particular departments, in order to particularly to deal with barriers to the student experience, and particularly when we're talking about it from an equity point of view as well. But that's rewriting the portfolios on the senior team, and that's a tricky conversation. So don't want to stray into that too much. But I think there's something there about, if you really want to get a handle of it, somewhere you really need to be joining up all elements of the student experience, both academic and non-academic. Otherwise, you just get a really disjointed picture.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Amatey. Fascinating answer. Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you. I think I've seen your excellent book behind you, which I've got here. So I just wanted to give it a plug for the people that watch this on YouTube afterwards. But it is related to the question I was going to ask you, and obviously you might have some reflections on what Amatey just mentioned. But given you obviously led service learning at King's and obviously worked internationally on some of these issues, we were talking about before about embedding engagement within the curriculum and the importance of that, particularly thinking about inclusivity. And we're going to be, Alistair's going to be talking about civic stuff in a moment, so I'm focusing really more on the sort of student experience element of this. What's the barriers for doing that post-pandemic, and what, you know, how do we create more of that universal offer so those experiential learning is more thoroughly embedded into the student experience? You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry, I was just typing a note on Amatey's comment, but then you picked on me. So for a while, I've sort of had this idea in the back of my head that actually what we need is a chief people officer, which is, you know, right top level post, which looks after the student experience and the staff experience. So they have joint responsibilities for that. And Amatey's comment just sparked that thought going back through my head. But to answer the service-led learning question, Richard, so clearly the extracurricular stuff we were talking about in the previous conversation is critically important and has been sort of damaged, shall we say, as we go through the pandemic, and, you know, in your survey, the Sutton Trust survey, and some of the data I've seen from King's backs all of that up. But there are, as you well know, deep inequities in who can access that extracurricular opportunities, and there are ways of addressing some of those equities. So at King's we have something called the King's Leadership Academy, which actually provides bursaries so people can participate in that extracurricular activity. But one of the advantages of service learning in the broadest sense is that actually brings those opportunities inside the curriculum. So you overcome those equity challenges that you face. And one of the things we did at King's was that we put in place a program to introduce service learning or service-led learning. And there's a whole literature on this, and everybody's got their own definition. My definition is, broadly speaking, you know, there's an academic component in the classroom. When you learn about something, there's an application of that in the community, however you define it, but it's outside the classroom and it's outside your sort of student community. And then there's a self-reflective element to that. So what did you learn, what worked, what didn't work, and what have you. But the point of service learning is it brings in that potentially extracurricular experience inside the curriculum. And I think they're very important equity issues in that. One of the things at King's that we're on the way to doing now is actually we're going to make it not compulsory, but strongly encouraged as part of reforms around the first year undergraduate courses, that every student does at least one module of service-led learning through their degree. Now, some of the more professional degrees, that's harder, but that's the aspiration we're moving to. And if you look at the US universities, I have to say they're well ahead on this topic vis-a-vis what we offer in the UK. But you know, to answer your question, coming out of this, I think more commitment around service-led learning would be a great lesson to take forward.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Jonathan. I just wanted to sort of now touch, before my time's up, with Hattie and Ben, really. I think there's some really interesting questions here for you around the sort of student voice in all of this, and also sort of the role of student unions, particularly thinking about students who, we hate the term catch up on this commission, so I'm not going to use it. I'm going to delete that term, but thinking about the opportunities which students can take next year, which they may not have taken last year. What concerns you? What are you optimistic about? What can universities, students' unions and services do to perhaps help manage the pressures which we might all be under, for students to capitalise on those opportunities? Hattie, can I hand over to you first?
Yeah, that's fine. I guess my first thought on this is that we've got a cohort of third year students that spend most of their time, you know, learning in the pandemic, learning at home, probably feeling quite disenfranchised, not feeling like, you know, this has been the experience that they signed up to get. And I think we've got a long way to go with winning those students back and bringing them back on side and making them feel like this university experience, although it's not been what you wanted it to be, it's still going to be valuable. You should, dig your heels in, finish and graduate, and that we should be doing everything we can to ensure that student success along the journey. So the classic taking the time to stop and listen to what students need and actually thinking about it holistically. So I think it's really important that we're thinking a lot more now about well-being and welfare and mental health support and all that kind of community support. I think one thing that I've realised this year is that lecturers are not just lecturers anymore, they're a contact point for students. It's been really difficult for a student that hasn't ever been on campus to understand, where the mental health support is, where the well-being is, all that kind of student experiencey, fluffy stuff that usually sits around the outside. That's actually been really integral to ensuring a student success this year. And I think we've asked a lot of academics this year, and probably thinking about how we support them to support students is something that we need to consider a little bit more, because it's been a really tough year for academics and for staff as much as it has been for our students. And I think as well, not just ensuring student success now, but ensuring that we get them to graduation through their assessments. What can we do to help that? But how do we still kind of remain that degree of integrity and not, what is that phrase that's like, the degree value, not devaluing the degree that our students have, but still ensuring that they're getting everything they need out of it, all their skills. So a lot of degrees at Southbank is skills-based learning, all that kind of lab workshop type stuff. Practicals, placements have been missed out on. How do we catch up on that this year? Without necessarily stressing out our academics even more than they're feeling already, I'm sure. And then how are we equipping them for life after graduation, and what we're doing to get them into the job market if that's what they're looking for, onto further study. And that's a couple of things that I've seen around, is like free masters or reduced masters programs, or like skills or catch-up learning over the summer. I think all that stuff is going to be really valuable.
Thank you. And Ben, finally, did you have any sort of reflections on that?
That use of the phrase about thinking about it more holistically is I think the key to success here. And students want to feel quite well networked with decisions and with communities and so on and so on. Think about it. There's a rich history of students, although sometimes they're accused of being quite selfish and quite self-reflective and thinking of their own needs. They show great solidarity to lecturers. They show great passion about their communities around them in all sorts of different ways. And so if we think about those relationships and those communities really holistically, it will plug them into working out a way forward. And I guess what I mean by that is, quite often I hear people, both students and university managers and others, talking about, I wanted to go back to how it used to be before COVID. Now, I get that temptation. I've lost freedoms, I've lost friends over the last year and a half. I get why I would like to go back, but I'd like to go forward. And if I can use the kind of these appetite, these relationships, network students into the sorts of decisions about how the university might evolve and how student experience might become more plugged into the curriculum and so on, they will welcome that opportunity to build solidarity with the people around them. And that, those comments a minute ago about creating a kind of chief students officer or that sort of thing, is really interesting, but I would urge a little bit of caution about this. Can't be siloed. You can't create one person who sits on a board and networks all 20,000 students. That doesn't work. I think at times, student union presidents and sometimes CEOs have been asked to try and do exactly that. And in many ways, I've valued the close proximity I've had to decisions in York during COVID. In other ways, I'm going, I can't do that. I can't sustain it, either in terms of the workload or in terms of true kind of integrity of being able to represent 20,000 students' diverse interests. It's impossible. So we have to find a way of bringing students in rather than a nominated professional responsible for them.
Thanks, Ben. I've run out of time, but I'm going to, Jane, if you've got any reflections, I think you're up next anyway from the next set of questions. So I'm going to hand back to Mary to get this forward.
Thanks, Richard. So many interesting things. I've found that I'm doing a little side conversation in my head about silos and networking, and maybe we'll have another session on that at another time. Thank you so much for that section. Mary, it's over to you now.
Thanks, Mary, and hello, everyone. Great discussion all day today, actually, really. I'm finding it quite difficult because my head's starting to explode, to be honest. Anyway, Jane, I'm just, as Richard said, I'm giving you advance warning. I'm going to start with you. And my theme, if you like, relates to the fact that there's a lot of research, including my own actually, about the importance of students feeling they can belong to their institution, their community, or whatever. Obviously, that also relates to the culture of place. And the prior experience of students and the experience that the students find when they engage with that culture. But I was wondering, because of the pandemic, I think a lot of the research has taken for granted the notion of place being a physical place. And I'm now referring to Jonathan's point earlier, that place can be either physical or virtual, perhaps even something else, especially when you're talking about belonging. And I just was, we were very, very interested in the work that you're doing in your portfolio, and just your initial reflections on that very incoherent set of things I just said.
Thanks, Mary. Well, I mean, I think that, I talked before about the notion of thinking about students as citizens and citizens of place and global citizens. And I think that's really important, that we recognise that our students have that role and that sense of their own sort of contribution and agency. And one of the things we've given quite a lot of thought to is the fact that, for the cohort who are coming to the university next year, they won't have had the opportunity for many of them to have visited Newcastle, had open days to sort of get a sense of, the layout of the city, the culture of the city. So been thinking really hard and working with our partners about how you can actually build that connection. And I mentioned before as well the sort of the peer mentoring process, which I think is really, really important in terms of building networks and contacts about the place. I also wanted to, one of the things I was reflecting on, it's always really fascinating to hear other people's sort of experiences and perspectives, is that I think over the last sort of 18 months, we've had much more of a sense of the fact that people have lives outside of the university. So for all of us, we've all sat there on Zooms and seen people's cats walking across in front of them. It's a great level of,
usually their bum, actually.
Yes. But I think we have become aware of the challenges of digital inclusion and the fact that people have caring responsibilities. Our students, are not, we're not necessarily talking about a homogenous group. They have different experiences, different needs, and I do think that it is really important we think about that. And I think, as other colleagues have referenced, sadly the challenge with the pandemic is I think it has and continues to exacerbate existing inequalities. And for me, I think, thinking about a lot of the work that we've done in Newcastle and the North East, we're sort of thinking about the student journey as being much more than the 3 years that a traditional undergraduate might be with us. But what is their experience in schools before they come to the university? How do we connect them and make sure they feel they belong, as you say, which is so important whilst at university, but also critically, what happens next? I think some of the points Hattie was making about the students who are going to be going into a labour market, what is our role and how do we create the best possible chances for those students to find fulfilling roles when they leave the university? Because again, for me, this is not, I don't see it in silos. What is good for the student experience is often good for wider community and the sort of societal benefits that come with that. And you know, one example I'd share is we developed an approach around an enrichment week during lockdown, which was all online, but we've learned from that, and we're going to be embedding that into our academic timetable, because I do agree with the comments that actually the sort of extracurricular and the curriculum, you know, that experiential learning actually should be linked. And what we're doing within that is focusing how students can actually make things happen and have an impact in their community, but linking it back to their academic learning. So we develop those projects with our students and our city partners, as well as local communities. So and I think that sense of the learning is connected with their impact in place. And I think our sort of the evidence is that actually has very positive outcomes for students.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. And I wanted to turn to Jonathan, because here's the next plug for your book, Jonathan, The New Power University. One of the things you're talking about there is virtual communities. And you know, do you think in this year of the pandemic that we've seen a sense of belonging around virtual communities, or is it just a sense of loss? Because I think that's one of the fundamental questions we're trying to ask in this commission, actually. So is it about loss, or have we seen belonging developing through virtual engagement?
But I mean, to a degree, Mary, I don't think those are mutually exclusive. So yeah, so I think you can have loss and you can have belonging at the same time. I think, and this sense of belonging, I'm wondering. I don't want to get too hard on this. Is that an old power concept? So if you read New Power and the original book by Henry Timms and Jeremy Hyman's, they talk about conditional affiliations. Yeah, which is not about long-term affiliations, is not about loyalty, it's about dipping in and dipping out. And they've got quite a lot of data around that, whether that's around political affiliations, whether it's around campaigning, whether it's around buying clothes or labels on, or whatever it is. So I absolutely accept that the existing research tells us that belonging is very important, and I'm not disputing that. But I'm just wondering if you sort of move to a new power Gen Z world, whether conditional affiliation that actually goes up the agenda and the issue of belonging is redefined in a way. Now, that's a sort of hypothesis. I can't give an answer to that. But I've lost sight in that muse. I've lost sight of your question.
No. I think that's exactly where I was hoping you'd go. I remember a quote from a really influential book on me, where it said, the student in interview said, I go through uni doesn't go through me.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly the point that you're making. And it might well be that actually our entire way we've conceived of this through the pandemic, might be actually moving us to something quite different. But I'd very much like to hear from Hattie, if that's okay. God, this is so powerful. I can just ask people. I'm so sorry to be doing this to you. But Hattie, just thinking about what we've been saying now, you talked about the loss that students felt in not getting quite what they'd expected. I wonder if you've got any comments on this belonging issue.
I was actually just thinking just then that a lot of our students, and I think a lot of inner city, modern universities, I think a lot of our students wouldn't first and foremost identify themselves as a student. They'd identify themselves, as a parent, as a learner, and, all these other things, right? But it doesn't stop them from wearing their lanyards all the time, because they're really, really proud of the fact that I'm at university. I'm the first person in my family to go to university, and this is amazing. But at the same time, we've got to recognise that if you're the first person in your family to go to university, you don't understand or recognise all these structures and how to go through them. And if you need help, then what do you do? And all these kinds of things, and thinking that you don't fit in or you don't belong. I'm not going to join a sports team. That's for all those traditional types of learners and traditional people that go to university. It's not for me. I don't fit in here. But at the same time, you've got that they're really proud to be at university and they'll work their socks off to get their first degree or their 2-1. They'll be, their whole family will be at graduation, and actually that's really, really powerful. So it's how do we ensure that these people are getting, out of university, that we're treating them with as much respect as they're, treating their lanyards or their student IDs or their graduation certificates, and what can we do to ensure that we're fitting into their lifestyle, and that we're not just assuming that everyone can access learning at the same rate that everyone else in their course can. And I think, like someone just said, we've had classrooms in people's homes. We can see how difficult or easy it's been for different types of people, and it's not been a one size fits all with learning from home. Yeah. We ran a phone banking campaign, and I think one thing that really stood out is that although some people were saying, yeah, I prefer to learn from home, or it's been okay, I've got a laptop and stuff, but at the same time, there's a woman that I spoke to who said, I've had to give my laptop to my son because he's doing his A-levels or his GCSEs, and so I've been doing my lectures from my phone, or I've got to now do a presentation to my whole class, my cohort, from my iPhone 7 or whatever it is, and I don't know how that's going to work. And so even though the university is offering free laptops or free resources, that kind of stuff, is it still good enough? You're going to give an engineering student a little Chromebook that's not going to work to run all this technical software and stuff that they need. So we can't always just be throwing money at a problem. And I think, again, respecting students as much as they're going to be respecting their degree. And I think this new generation of university students, we are very aware that we're going to be racking up 60,000, 70,000 pounds worth of debt, and we're not coming to uni for fun anymore. And I think that's where some of that extracurricular and perception stuff comes in, that people want to be taking part in academic opportunities more and more, and people are pushing themselves to get degrees. This isn't just I'll just go to uni now, it's only free, or it's only £2,000. It's a big commitment now, and I think the people that have made that decision to come to university, it's quite a big step now, as opposed to previous generations of people that have come into higher education.
Hattie, thank you so much. Mary, I'm going to leave it there because I think that was incredibly powerful.
It was fantastic, and it made me think about how quick we are to put things into the online or the face-to-face silo, and I think we've done that around teaching and learning. I think there's a danger that we start to think that communities and belonging have to be in one pot or the other, when actually you need a sort of omni-channel community and an omni-channel sense of belonging. I mean, my relationships with my kids consist of lots of WhatsApp, lots of face-to-face, and lots of speaking on the phone, and a few other bits and bobs in between. And I don't think of it as blended parenting or anything. I should not go off on that riff because we are a bit short of time, and I want to hand the mic to Alistair, please.
Mary, thank you very much. And the challenge of being the fifth person, I think, to ask you questions, we've had such rich and deep answers from you all. I think I'm in fear of asking you the same things again. And so I'm going to come from a slightly different angle, but do say if you think this has been covered enough already. We've had a year, 18 months, where universities, I think everyone will agree, have made a big contribution to tackling the pandemic and the challenges of the pandemic. But we're moving now into a year which we certainly hope is a year of economic and social recovery. And I'm interested to know what you think universities and indeed student unions should be doing differently to maximise their contribution to this recovery. And given that the theme is very much sort of student focused, I'm particularly interested in what you see as the role of students, perhaps also international students that we haven't touched on particularly in this session, to that economic and social recovery. Jane, do you want to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. I mean, I think in many ways we're sort of seeing a real spotlight put on the role that universities and students can have, and obviously the UK work on economic and social recovery is something that I've been working with the Vice Chancellor of Newcastle, Chris Day, on, and so the most obvious one is around future workforce. I think there's been some of the research around over the next 5 years. Newcastle universities in the country will be providing nearly 200,000 nurses and nearly 188,000 teachers. So making sure that we are really kind of developing programs that equip our students to be able to go into those key roles is absolutely critical. And I think, you know, it's interesting, the debates that are going on at the moment around skills, higher level skills, technical skills, and how we can sort of work with our employers and our students during their time at university to make sure that they are well placed to contribute to that. I think the other point that you make about the kind of global contribution, for me, I think, you know, there's the obvious sense that actually international students have a huge economic impact on the places. You know, in Newcastle, our international students contribute over £175 million to the local economy. So it is massive. But actually, I think what is even more important is the global connectivity that comes with our students, and not just in economic terms, but the cultural diversity and perspectives, the creativity that comes from that, I think is something that can't be underestimated. And if I may, finally, I think there is something really about future leaders. You know, a lot of things we've talked about today are the examples of where our students have really stepped up to the plate and really made a huge difference in their communities at some of the most challenging times that we've had, really post-war time. And in Newcastle, for example, we've been running a programme with Common Purpose called Newcastle 150, which is working with young people between the ages of about 18 and 24 to ask them what they want their legacy to be as leaders in terms of making Newcastle a place that is cleaner and greener and more inclusive. And I think giving that agency is going to be really important in terms of the future recovery of the city and the wider region.
Jane, thanks very much. It's really helpful. Hattie, I wonder if I could ask us the same question to you, but maybe just almost slightly more kind of challenging on universities. Do you think universities are doing enough to help students think about how the world may be different post-pandemic, and in fact the role they may want to play as leaders in the workforce is also going to be potentially quite different?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I guess for South Bank, we, again, like I've said, got a lot of technical skills with that kind of stuff, and we've got our schools are quite plugged into the workforce, and we've got lots of partnerships within, you know, industries and all that kind of stuff. So our lecturers are kind of live in the workforce in that term, and pushing students and bringing in new ideas, new theories and new ways of working into the classrooms, which, you know, you might not get in a more traditional institution. Yeah, and I think what's interesting about South Bank as well is that we're a group. So we have schools and a couple of colleges attached to us. So there's all that kind of linked learning, the linking with FE and HE. And what I'd say about, you know, working with the local community is that South Bank, I mean, I'm going to sound like an absolute advocate here, but the executive have been really good at identifying what the local community needs. So not only are we building buildings for ourselves, but we're building them for the community, and we're going to open it in January. It's going to be like a learning hub, and people can come in and do free courses on, you know, kind of skills for learning and digital skills and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, have like create a real community hub where there might not necessarily be one already. And as well as that, working with the council in Croydon. So they identified that there's a severe lack of nurses in South London. And South Bank said, hey, like, we'd love to build a campus if you can help us out with that, and we'll train loads of nurses for you, and we'll help you out with that. So I think that's been a really great example of, you know, especially within the pandemic and all that stuff. Like our nursing students and our nursing lecturers and academics have really jumped to the opportunity to take part and help out, you know, in London where it's been quite stressful and the rates have been high with COVID. And obviously it's helped out our students a lot with when we had that a 6-month period, I think, where nursing students were able to have paid placements. And that was amazing for me to see that our students could, you know, get that real hands-on learning experience, and they loved to be a part of, you know, that workforce and part of that front line. Because I was quite scared for our students, because I was obviously representing them. I was like, well, the health and safety, like, our students are going to get really sick if we push them to the front line. And actually, we did some research and asked our students how they feel, and they were like, yeah, this is amazing. This is exactly why I want to be a nurse. Like, this is once in a lifetime opportunity. And I was like, Okay, great. Crack on then. Have a great time. So yeah.
Hattie, thank you for that fantastic example, and it's great to hear of that that enthusiasm from students to sort of participate in that way. Thank you. Ben, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, there are loads of agendas that students share with other parts of society, right?
Yeah.
And for me, this is the massive opportunity that universities have got right now, is to find those shared agendas and to push them really quite hard. So we know that as we hopefully pull out of the pandemic, the buses are going to start running again, and the rules are going to change to whether you wear a face mask and how many there are an hour will change. And we know that students moan about public transport, but so does the unemployed person who's trying to get to their job, or the elderly person who's trying to pick up their meds, or or the business who's trying to make sure they can get customers into their shop. We know that students understandably moan about the quality of private landlords, but so does the young professional who's just got on the ladder and can't, so actually let's join together these shared agendas around housing and health and transport, environmental impacts, and international travel. I want to travel abroad as much as be able to welcome international students from abroad. So if we can hook all that together, I mean, this is kind of mass mobilization 101, right? And it's about common solutions to shared problems.
Ben, thanks. That's a brilliant call to action, and I think now I can certainly see how you can unleash that kind of campaigning power of students linking up with other groups. Jonathan, I wondered if you wanted to pick up on that theme as well.
Yeah, well, to be honest, Alice, I wanted to pick up on the international student theme, so I can come back in on that. Or so I think it's really important as we come out of this pandemic, we start to understand the motivations for international students, which has got to be around cultural competencies, diversity, and understanding others. In our current system, and I know this is going to take me away from education, the motivation for many universities around international students is cross-subsidizing research. And if there's one policy that we could make to change the situation, it would be moved to full economic costs, 100% full economic costs, cut the volume of research by 20%. I'm very comfortable with that. And by doing that, you would then create the right motivation for bringing in international students, rather than seeing international students as a cash cow. And it seems to me that these systems are so interconnected, you can't have a conversation about international students without acknowledging that issue. But if we come out of the pandemic, address that issue, and see international students as diversifying our student communities, then I'm wholly supportive. If we see international students as subsidizing undercosted research, then we need to have a different conversation.
Jonathan, thanks. That's a really fair and an important point. Thank you. Amatey, you've got a brilliant sort of overview of the sector, both as a student leader and now in your kind of current role. What is it that universities, student unions can do to kind of unleash this, power and enthusiasm of students on the recovery?
So I'll start with the challenging aspect of this, and then end on the positive. The one thing I think we do need to recognize, and I don't know what the answer to this challenge is that, and if we're talking about, typically the younger students, not necessarily the typical student, but if we look at sort of the younger Gen Z students and some, we also do need to recognize that their economic position is incredibly challenging coming out of university. If we're thinking about first of all the market that they'll be graduating into during the pandemic is hugely challenging, and all the stats around rent costs and the likelihood of earning their own home, and the relative wealth that generation has compared to previous generations at that age. It's a really difficult picture. So in one sense, when we talk about the economic recovery, there needs to be something about how do they also benefit more from the pie, as it were, in terms of being able to put that generation in a less unequal position. So that's the first thing. So, you know, what is their role in that? I'm not sure, but I think we need to recognise that they are also, for want of a better, you know, in need of being leveled up as a generation, and that obviously cuts across the country. One of the really interesting projects, though, that I've been involved in is, and we just had a session yesterday, it is as part of the university's access and participation plan. They put together a project where some of their students from a range of disciplines are trained up to be consultants, and they do projects for the local council. And the council identifies a couple of areas where there are needs. They get the training. So we've just finished their training, then they go off and then they do a sort of 6-week project, write up a report, and the initial feedback, we've just started, the initial feedback from the councils has been absolutely fantastic. They have really benefited from the new perspectives on these issues. It's given them the space and the time to really think through what some of the challenges are. And there's a real convergence of interest there. I mean, for the students, they get practical experience and work experience working as a team with students from other disciplines which they wouldn't normally work with, to solve real challenges that the local council and the local community are facing. And I think, you know, that's one model, but I think that's an example of and you can do this in lots of different ways through community organizing efforts as well. But I think this is one of the ways in which we need to start thinking about, you know, how can we get students, you know, even moving away from the traditional placement model, which is fairly individual in lots of cases. So as an individual student, you get put on individual placement, but actually thinking about bringing students together in teams to solve local challenges, I think is something that I'd like to see more of, and I think would really benefit, bring that diversity of thinking to local economic recovery as well.
Amatey, thank you. It's a great example, and one that maybe we could draw on for the commission. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for their amazing contributions and depth of answers. Mary, I should hand back to you now because time is ticking on.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alistair and everybody. And I just, in the last kind of 60 seconds, just want to kind of reflect a bit on the last hour and a half. The first thing I wanted to do is to absolutely grab the point about awarding gaps for students of colour. You know, normally we make miserably slow progress on this, and actually, if we have had a big leap forward, if we don't jump on this and kind of bag it and make sure it continues, I think we'll be doing a big disservice. So I did just want to make that point. I think more generally, this has been an incredibly sort of strategic conversation, hasn't it? You know, we've talked about organizational design, we've talked about collaborative leaderships, we've talked about the interaction between communities and belonging and place and common solutions to shared problems within the community, and indeed students working as teams, not just as individuals in some of these spaces. Service learning conceptually, I think, is a very kind of strategic concept. And I felt like this whole idea of kind of students, citizens interacting with the idea of future leaders and future workforce has, I mean, it's just been such an interesting conversation. Once again, I thought I was reeling from this morning, so now I'm reeling again with the whole, I just want to, colleagues and both fellow commissioners, but especially our guest today, I really want to thank you for helping us have such a really, really fascinating conversation. So huge thanks to Jonathan, Jane, Amatey, Hattie and Ben. We just so appreciate the way you've got us all thinking about the challenges ahead. Have a lovely rest of your afternoon, a great weekend. Thank you again.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye.